we have a quorum, so let's go live. And I see the message is up. So good morning. It's Tuesday, April 6th, 10:31 a.m. It's a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. And we are following up on our work on development of, it started with a conversation about community scale renewable energy. And we've been talking with various people in the system that all has to work seamlessly and well together. And we've heard from some of the distribution utilities, some of the development community. And today we're visiting with Velco, the transmission partners, the backbone of the entire system. So with that, I'd like to welcome back to the committee Mr. Presame and Mr. Johnson. Good morning. Good to see you both again.
Good morning.
So the floor is yours. Turn it over to you and look forward to learning more about how Velco's looking at the evolution of energy supply here in the state of Vermont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Carrick Johnson. I'm the Chief Innovation and Communications Officer for Vermont Electric Power Company, Velco. It's a pleasure to be with you here this morning. We're going to, I'm just going to tell you right at the outset, Hans and I probably have put together a few too many slides, but what we thought we would do, we prefer this to be a conversation, Mr. Chairman. So we'll walk through, we will give you a little bit on Velco just because as there may be, I think there are a couple new members that may be joining us in a few moments. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll foreshadow and tell you some key points about our draft 2021 Vermont Long Range Transmission Plan. Mr. Chairman, what we thought for the committee, as you consider pieces of legislation, this is the most up-to-date analysis after 18 months of work that we could provide you, and happy to answer any questions regarding specific legislative proposals. But we thought the most constructive use of our time and the best information we could provide you would be in the context of what we've learned undertaking this work. So with that, why don't I get started? Quickly on Velco. I'm not sure if we've ever talked about this, Mr. Chairman, and with this committee before. I don't know that I have before. Really, Velco's vision, believe it or not, is to create a sustainable Vermont. Now, some may feel that's trite. It really isn't. And I think if you've met the people who work at Velco, you know it isn't. It's a living, breathing vision that we aspire to each and every day. Our mission is to serve as a trusted partner in furtherance of that vision. You can see our role as it's there and our related responsibilities. Two things not on the slide I'd like to draw this committee's attention to. One is our ownership structure. We are a unique creature in the nation for a couple of reasons. One is we're owned by 17 distribution utilities and a public benefits corporation, the Vermont Low Income Trust for Electricity. That is a unique ownership structure. When that happened, when Green Mountain Power acquired CVPS, it really fundamentally changed our board of directors. And as a result, it's, I think, an incredibly effective functioning board. It really serves as almost like the energy kitchen table for Vermont. So our ownership structure and our governance, I think, makes us unique. Secondly is how the money works. We're the only transmission utility I am aware of in the nation that has that ownership structure, but also any profit we make, any returns we make above our expenses are required by state regulatory requirement to go back to our distribution utility owners. And they in turn are required to take it off the bill, effectively to credit towards their customers, towards their co-op members, towards their, if you want to call them ratepayers, towards the people that they serve. It's required to reduce their bill. So effectively, Mr. Chairman, anytime we can do good work beyond keeping the grid reliable, our fundamental portion, that is to somehow create additional value that accrues to every person who's connected to the grid in Vermont. The long range plan. This is, Hans and I were discussing prior to this meeting, Mr. Chairman, this is the 6th one we've done. We do a long range plan every 3 years. And some of the members of your committee, Mr. Chairman, will recall the genesis of the requirement to do this plan. It was you could say it was born of a bit of pain. The Northwest Vermont Reliability Project, the NRP. Velco hadn't done a transmission project for about 25 years. Vermonters hadn't experienced a transmission project for about 25 years. As a consequence, there were things in retrospect we would have, could have, and should have done differently. But fundamentally, people felt they didn't have adequate notice. We surprised them. And part of the genesis for why we do a plan every 3 years, we don't have an integrated resource plan. We don't do an IRP. This effectively somewhat serves as an IRP. More importantly, it seeks to give not just a 10, but a 20-year look ahead. Where do we see the challenges to grid reliability such that we're going to need to build more transmission unless it is solved? So there's specific outreach requirements we have, but that middle bullet, the full, fair, and timely consideration of all cost-effective non-wire solutions. That's what we're supposed to be doing. I would argue, Mr. Chairman and committee, that there is no state that requires more of a transmission utility to work as hard as it can to not build transmission. And we're very comfortable with that. And I think it helps promote collaboration, and that's a place we like to live. So lastly, I'll say, especially in this regard for this committee with this current draft plan, is when we do a better job at effectively communicating what we've learned, I think better decisions get made. And I think your committee is a testament to that, Mr. Chairman. So as I said, this is a collaborative process. Hans, and I should say Hans Presame, who is our lead planner, is an incredibly talented individual. He really led the work for Velco. And this is an 18-month process to do it, to undertake this work, even as you're attempting to keep up with things as they change. It's a dynamic environment, and you're seeking to keep up with it. Some of you may know, I know we just have the acronym there, the Vermont System Planning Committee. Just as when we were required to do this plan, also what was created was the Vermont System Planning Committee. This is the group that's required, that on which sit all the utilities, the state regulators, energy advocacy groups, industrial customers, commercial customers, residential customers. I think there's 6 major stakeholder groups. That group is an effective forum for the discussion. It goes through that committee, this plan does, for their review. You can see, in addition to the review by that group, we specifically ask and get data, get information on electric vehicles, for instance, from VEIC. We get cold climate heat pump forecasts from Efficiency Vermont. So this isn't just something we're very insular. We utilize Itron with a national vendor, very respected, used throughout New England. We've used them for years, they're very good, as well as homegrown Vermont companies that have their probably the best on the ground analyses, exactly what's going on with electric vehicles and what's going on with cold climate heat pumps. As you can see there, even the scope, here's what we're attempting to study. That is actually washed through and reviewed by the Vermont System Planning Committee and the utilities. Since we are a statewide body and we advocate and participate at the regional level, we also consult with ISO New England and ensure we have their input. And because in the end, Vermont is not an island, and we have to integrate our work in the transmission system with the other 5 New England states. Other stuff that we'll get into, but additional collaboration ones, we use Daymark Energy Advisors, which is a new tool which Hans helped develop, a new analytical tool with Daymark Energy Advisors for scenario planning. Because there's so many scenarios and different inputs, having a more effective way to iterate on what the world's going to look like, especially when it takes 5 years for us to put an asset in place, having that ability to continue to amend the futures that you might see is incredibly valuable to us. You can see the other outreach that's there. I just draw your attention to the last bullet there that talks about regional planning commissions and stakeholders. We're just starting now to have, in advance of the next iteration of the Act 174 driven plans by regional planning commissions. We're meeting with all of those actually in collaboration with the Department of Public Service. They've been very wonderful to work with in sharing information. We'll be collaborating with them, so those kind of conversations to advance and align vision on energy. We've met with the Renewable Energy Vermont, initial discussion with Energy Action Network. We're talking to a couple of business groups. We're really trying to get people who care and who have the time. Here's what this plan on energy is telling us. But as Hans has schooled me, and Hans, please weigh in when you see an opportunity here and a need. What's important to remember? What we think, Mr. Chairman, and this is something that I think really in a post-Texas environment, I think this really bears repeating. System reliability will be maintained. I'm not saying there are no risks, but I would say Vermont and New England have done a really incredibly effective job at keeping this up and keeping the lights on. Other people, there may be other ways to keep the lights on. I'm not saying it's the only way, but in terms of a commitment to system reliability, I would match our metrics, our performance results against any transmission grid in North America. And we have some initial data that bears out our reliability record. Secondly, and this does seem to surprise people, Vermont really is a transmission dependent state. For all the in-state generation we have, we are more dependent on pulling in energy from outside resources than we have ever been. Further, if we hope, given the rise and hopefully the continued rise of in-state generation, if we want to export that energy, there again, you're going to need to have a robust transmission system. So whether we're importing to keep the lights on or exporting to take advantage of markets in addition to maintaining system reliability, Vermont is a very transmission dependent state. Significant load growth is expected for winter peaking. And probably the biggest point I'd make, since the whole point of this plan is to give people a heads up on whether or not we're going to have to be building more transmission. Although we presume additional load management of the kind I think this committee has been briefed on, Senator Bray, Hans and his team and Velco, we don't see any major upgrades needed for the next 10 years. We do think we're trying to meet the grid where it's going to be. And we think given the things that are on track, we're going to be all right. We're not going to have to build substantial transmission. So that's important to remember. Another thing that's important to remember is we go back and forth on solar, and it's had so much value, efficiency in solar to get us where we are. But in terms of incremental additional solar and its ability to reduce costs at peak, effectively we're tapping out at the value to reduce peak costs. So you're not going to get that huge value. We've already shifted the peak to after dark. So additional solar won't necessarily, won't de facto help reduce that cost. And you can see the other points there. And I think that need for further collaboration and innovation, that is going to be a consistent theme that we will hit. So what's new in this plan?
Can I interrupt with a quick question on can you talk about the statement you're saying we don't have major upgrades to do for a decade? What's the relationship between Velco and the Shihai challenge? Is that transmission that you're part of, or is that DU level distribution issues more?
Why don't I do this? I'll give a quick topical answer, and Hans, I'd ask you to weigh in here. I would say we have a role where we have a line that is essentially bleeds a lot of energy. It's an inefficient line. And we could make that a much bigger pipe, but that would add cost directly onto Vermont. So what we've worked out with our distribution utility owners is we're going to upgrade that line. We're going to create a little bit of headroom should we need it in the future. That's our contribution to fixing Shihai. GMP is doing their fix on a couple things, and I think Vermont Electric Co-op have some projects. So it's absolutely not a reliability issue. However, we understand, and again, seeking to create a sustainable Vermont, how can we strike that balance? So in order to get the region to pay for an investment that Velco would make, it has to be tied to system reliability. And so the sweet spot that we arranged that is, we need to upgrade this line. We won't go crazy and make it a huge pipe that would substantially lift like the ceiling on renewable energy development in that region, but it will create the prospect of being able to, should we in Vermont in collaboration with our owners decide that the benefit is worth that cost. But why don't I stop there, Hans? Does that sound about right, or what would you say?
Right, I think so, Carrick. So the projects that are being pursued currently are subtransmission projects or projects at substations along the VC system. Those do not involve Velco facilities. We are evaluating one of the transmission lines that cross the border, and currently if we were to upgrade this line, it would not be funded by the region. ISO New England does not consider generation constraints to be reliability issues. So we're studying the line to see what we could do there. As Carrick noted, we don't believe that the region will pay for this upgrade.
Do you know if if everyone follows through on the steps that Mr. Johnson was just outlining between GMP, Velco, VEC, will that eliminate the curtailment issue? If I know it sounds like Mr. Johnson's saying you're not adding so much more headroom to support additional development, but do you know if it will deal with the current curtailment issue?
Largely, yes. Largely.
You can't say yes or you get denied the money.
So if you look at the testimony for the projects that are being proposed, the project will resolve more than 90% curtailment events. There are some curtailments that cannot be addressed. There's associated with transmission outages that would require the plants to be reduced close to their minimum amount. And resolving those would be very, very costly, actually too costly. So we're not addressing every curtailment event, but 90% or more will be resolved.
Okay, great. Thanks. I don't want to take us off track too much because I know you have, we're on to the plan. All right, thanks for that. Just wanted to check in. Senator McDonald.
Just, when you talked about creating some headroom, what I'm hearing is, well, we'll propose this as a way to distribute in the name of sustainability for future needs to meet your reliability requirements. And if you play the cards right and write your proposal in such a way, it may also serve to get some electricity out of the Shia. Is that what you're saying?
Let's be clear. I think we're saying the same thing. What I had said was, Hans is right, is the solutions that are being pursued, the B22 line, I think, Hans, the solutions that GMP and others are doing, that will take care of the 90%. The project we're talking about is a line that runs north-south on the western side of the state that will also unlock some just a bit above the current state for us. We could have advocated we want to have a much thicker conductor, a much bigger line, but that would have involved an increment of cost that we can justify that investment up to a point as reliability. The bigger pipe, the bigger conductor, the thicker wire that would have allowed for greater export of energy from that region, that would have been borne solely by Vermonters. And that was something at the particular time that our owners felt, with all the other costs that we see coming, let's take care of this. Let's get these other solutions in play. Let's see what happens at the PUC and state policy there. And we'll do our project that will essentially, it has an increment of space that we won't use initially, but we can justify as a reliability investment, because obviously if you're paying now, is what's called the Handy-Whitman curve, inflation and other costs of projects. It makes sense if we need to fix it with a little not future proofing, but a little growth in there. So that's the way we're going to do it. And then such that if in fact there needs to be more exports from that area, we'll be able to avail ourselves of that capacity, but we won't avail of ourselves of that capacity immediately. Does that help, or is that just confusing?
So you avail yourself of the capacity means you'll be able to use it to export electricity where it's locked up and it can't get out?
Yeah,
Okay, so the goal
but not
is
as much as we could have, right? We did as much as we could as a reliability investment, so it didn't add additional costs that only Vermont would pay.
well, if you build too much, you'll get caught. They won't. You get 90, you're getting a 90% aid to build this project, because if you call it something else, we'll have to pay for it ourselves.
That's well, and thankfully, due to Hans and his and his team's integrity, we have a reputation for we're very straightforward. This is reliability. This is not, and that actually saves us a lot of money, time, and aggro when you have that kind of reputation. Sorry, let me. Okay,
So are we?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, when Vermont was the first to begin to deal with the energy efficiency utilities, the ISO turned its back and said, no, we're not in that. We're in the electric distribution business. And to the credit of the Vermonters who went to ISO, ISO was eventually persuaded to recognize that. How much longer are we going to be caught in this business of being subsidized to get electricity from generators to places that don't have it? And when are we going to have some influence with ISO to be able to get stuff out that that is constrained? And why aren't you doing that?
Well, if that's not rhetorical, if that's actually a question, what I'll say is we succeeded in getting, I would say this, Hans invoked the 90% help for curtailment. I say we did even better in terms of getting consideration of efficiency at the regional level by ISO. It took longer probably than it should, but it did. And then we turned our attention to advocating to giving greater credit to solar and other forms of renewable energy and really unlocking that value. And we had modest successes there. Now Vermont and Massachusetts and Connecticut, some other states are saying, still and yet, those are great, grateful for those, but you're not moving fast enough. We don't understand your planning process. It's a bit opaque. ISO New England has changed its mission statement. They're changing their board. They're attempting to try and align themselves more closely with state adopted policies. And really, to tell you the truth, I give June Tierney a lot of credit for that department. She was an early and aggressive advocate for states as sovereign entities and the fact that their policies need to be accepted and incorporated. So we've had some success. It's just that when it's that much of a consensus organization and their strict focus is on reliability and market-based solutions, and Vermont's we're the only non-regulated state within New England, so it puts us we're in a little bit of a different position. So anyway, I would say things are changing at ISO New England. We've had successes on efficiency. We've had successes on consideration of renewable generation. FERC order 20, sorry, Mr. Chairman, but FERC order 2222 that will allow for aggregation of distributed generation. That's which ISO New England needs to incorporate. That's happening. So there's success. It's changing. I would say it's changing. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that stuff is slow and it's like moving granite uphill. So thanks for going into detail on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Quickly, what I'll say is what's new in this plan? Like I think I've talked about much of this before. Probably the thing that's new is this one. For the first time, we said there's at least 3 versions of the world that we're going to encounter over the next 10 and 20 years. So Hans and his team have put together this high, medium, and low scenarios. If EVs and cold climate heat pumps and really take off, what does that look like? If maybe there's modest growth, kind of what does that mean for the transmission grid? And if there's really not much growth at all, despite what we think is going to happen, what might that look and what does that portend for the transmission grid? So we've never had those kind of 3 scenarios that we followed through all the way through in a plan. Usually we came up with one consensus view. This time we have 3. The other thing I think, Mr. Chairman, for this committee, because this was an issue before your committee last year, the 2018 plan posited and contemplated incorporating 1,000 megawatts of solar, and thus what need to happen to the grid to be able to accommodate an additional 1,000 megawatts. And I remember we had this slide that talked about, really, we don't have to make we don't really have to make many changes as long as all these caveats are adhered to. Well, the caveats we had were substantial and frankly weren't really realistic. This time, what we thought to do is let's be as straight up and not really optimistic, not overly rosy, but not overly pessimistic, trying to find that balance so you can see some of the assumptions we built in. There's always going to be some power that we're going to be importing. We also know that there's larger generation projects that are in the queue that are likely, in some cases, to be built, 20 megawatts and up. There's inherent limits on transformers from our distribution utility customers that we need to take in consideration. And then lastly, there's different levels of effectiveness. Some solar PV sites are really, really good, and others are not so. And trying to incorporate, rather than having a homogeneous take on all of them, giving more site-specific information. It's more complicated, it takes more analysis, but we think it makes for a more effective study. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to wrap up with these, like the recommendations. I'm going to ask Hans to go into greater detail, but if you hadn't read the report, what does it really say? So, or what would we advise, having done all this work, what has occurred to us to recommend to others? You've heard this before, but it always bears repeating. We think we need to better align and give weight to the grid impacts of where we put generation. We think this next generation of Act 174 siting plans and town plans, we think they're going to be even better. We think with a PUC, understanding SHI and trying to resolve things, and they have some interconnection 5.500 proceeding that's just starting, we think that will help. But that's one of the balls we need to keep our eyes on, making sure that that gets reflected. You can put generation that detracts from the grid, that adds costs, that adds burden, and you can put in places where it really helps. We're just asking to give weight to that. Next up, and you're going to hear this all the time about flexible load. There's so many more grid participants that are on and off. And the idea is, how do you orchestrate this? How do we keep these things flexible? Here's some specific points we think that will demonstrably help our ability to manage the grid. One is to enable inverter grid support function. I know, well, you see the bullet there. Effectively, there's little widgets. There's a capacity built in these inverters that are part of the solar generation facilities that if you activate, you just set it and forget it, and can control voltage. So I think you've heard, I have a colleague, Frank Utori, who describes, I think Hans, he describes it as you have central station, whether it's a nuke plant or oil or something, are dogs and cats with solar versus these kinds of centralized, more traditional plants. Dogs and cats. Dogs stay when they're here, they won't run away. Cats will. So that's how you characterize solar plants, because their inverters would shut down. The least little bit of turbulence, they would shut down. The idea is to build the functionality so they stay unless they really need to shut off. They make it a bit more resilient. We think that would help. Next up, we think, and we've heard this from our distribution utility customer owners, they're looking for ways now to better manage distributed generation within their service territory. Who controls how that arrives? That's obviously yet to be worked out, but everyone has a stake in the effective management of these resources. They get a better price for their product, the grid's more reliable, and customers are better served. That's why we think that makes more sense. And I'm going to go through these because I think they're worthy. We say continue to evolve with storage. We've been looking at, for Velco's sake, for storage in earnest, say, for the last 8 or 9 months, I think now. I don't know that we've had we now having specific use cases for a radio system and the like, where storms are more intense, they cause more damage. We have mountaintop facilities that are out for longer, so we need better battery storage, at least in those facilities and others. But we know storage is going to play a huge role. Do we have it exactly figured out yet? No, we don't. Thankfully, though, when we have Vermont Electric Co-op and Green Mountain Power and Vermont Public Power Supply Authority and BED, these customers are doing really nationally innovative things with storage. So our job is to try and anticipate and eliminate obstacles to their use of storage and figure out how we can to keep the most effective and reliable grid at the least cost that we can. But that really depends on, data. I think you've heard this before, right? That's the strategic resource. All the bits and bytes and understanding what's on, how big is it, where is it, when it's on, when it's off, and coordinating all these assets are connected to the grid. That's a very, very big deal. Then lastly, on these flexible load management points is the deepen and broaden the fiber communications network. I think you've heard the Department of Public Service. I think you've probably heard from Green Mountain Power about the convergence of communication with grid operations. Velco has about a 1,500-mile, 72-strand fiber optic system right now. It's critical to system reliability, and it's becoming more critical. So we're right now in the early stages of a project to really grow our existing system by about another 700 to 800 miles of fiber optic cable to go much deeper and broader in Vermont to connect to every 150 kilowatt asset that we can. So that's every distribution substation, that's every storage facility, that's every distributed generation that we can to be able to better orchestrate this. That's the way we'll have a much more reliable grid. That's why we'll have a better idea on where stuff should be located. That's how developers will have a better idea where it's good to go, where it's not, and what those costs are going to be associated with that. And then lastly, in terms of grid reinforcements, there still could be, and in some cases, again, the purpose of the plan is to identify so we don't have to do transmission and the like. Having said all that, there may be some points, whether it's transmission or sub-transmission, a little bit lower voltage or distribution investments to be able to absorb and integrate significant uptakes in electric vehicles and cold climate, really electric vehicles or electrification of fleets, whether it's state vehicles or trucking fleets and the like. Those will take some investments. So we think some of that will help with greater flexibility. And then lastly, I guess we'd say, again, we're not an island. All this work is taking place, and Hans and his team did this work. Really, at the same time, we're looking at significant offshore wind resources being developed just off the coast of Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, further down in New Jersey. And there's there's active consideration and advocacy for policies that would socialize the cost of the transmission necessary to bring those offshore wind resources to market, to socialize those across all 6 New England states. It's just starting. But these kinds of things we're talking about, and what can the overall customer bear for costs and like, we're very mindful, Senator McDonald, you talked about regional advocacy. There may be some things that we would benefit and we want offshore wind. But in terms of, it's always the same thing, exactly when and what's the price. So these things are happening right now, even as it's going. There's also active consideration whether or not the New England Clean Energy Connect line that would come down to Connecticut through Maine, through New Hampshire, has been very controversial. It's going to be subject to a referendum in Maine. Whether or not that gets built, there's already talk, we need one more line connecting Hydro-Quebec to the metropolitan centers of New England. So the Hydro-Quebec, this is the new part, and unlike just to send energy down, but it's effectively to serve as a battery to send energy up. It's a sort of a twist, but it does make great kind of physics sense. So
An electric sponge.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right, Senator. So Hans, I'm sure I butchered. Does that make sense in terms, did I miss anything in terms of the recommendations, please?
Oh, that's excellent, Kerry.
Okay. If there's no further questions on this, Mr. Chairman, what we thought we'd do, we'd go to a shot so you can get a right up to date, like what does our system look like right now? And Hans will walk us through that, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay with you.
Okay. And just in terms of pacing, we're not going to start 126 until 11:30. So if anyone is watching and waiting for that bill, we've pushed it back half an hour because we started a little late. So we have about half an hour left, just so that you and Mr. Presser may know.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Right, so I'll jump right ahead. On this slide, just showing the generation portfolio in Vermont. We have quite a bit, right? We have about 1,000 megawatt of generation in the state, which matches our peak load in the winter or summer. We have about 1,000 megawatt of peak. But the issue here is that most of our generation is weather dependent, whether it's hydro, wind, or solar. And the fastest growing technology is solar PV. We're currently at about 400 megawatts in the state, and that's growing pretty fast. Next slide, please, Carrick. And this is just a geographical distribution of solar PV. It's growing over time. This was measured in December 2019. We were at 361 megawatts. And just highlighting on the right there, the two zones that are within the SHIA, if you're interested, Newport and Highgate, the towns in the northern portion of the state that are served by VEC. Next slide, please. And this is some of the effects that we've seen over time since 2013, showing the lowest day of the year usually happens in April, the last week of April. And progressively, the loads have been dropping. In the last measurement in April 2020, the lowest load was measured at 200 megawatts. This is net load. It's not the gross load, but this is the load after you take into account solar PV contribution. Next slide.
Oh, is that like the lowest? I mean, just put that in a historical I mean, is that like the lowest we've ever had, or?
Well, yes, that's correct. And we think the load will be even lower this year. Certainly, we've added some solar PV in 2020 and beginning of 2021. Usually, solar PV grows.
I'm lost, Mr. Chair. I apologize, but I'm having trouble reading the graphs, but
sure,
with the vocabulary, I don't know what you're telling us. So,
is it correct to say that chart is the load at the higher the line, the older the curve?
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
So in some detail here, the left axis is the amount of load as measured from 0 to 8 megawatts, and this is a day, right? So this is a day in April, and the dates are from 2013 to 2020. And as we add solar PV, the load is dropping. This is what we call a duck curve, or at least for Vermont, the Shint curve. Last measurement was in April 2020. It's a brown curve at the bottom, showing a load level of 200 megawatts at hour 15 or 3 p.m. That's the lowest that the load has been during the springtime. And it's going to continue to drop as we add more and more solar PV in the state.
well, in the spring and the shoulder months are the ones that we don't have problems, and when the sun shines, where we need something to absorb it, right?
Yes, although in the springtime there's very little load, and with additional generation like solar PV, hydro, wind, we tend to reduce the net load. And as we add more, say in the next 2, 3, 4 years, we'll probably be exporting out of the state. We're not going to be able to absorb all the energy that we're producing in state.
So on that lowest curve, the 2020 curve, where we're down to 200 megawatts, what percentage approximately of that solar generation is all behind the meter? So it's versus dispatchable.
It's essentially all of solar PV. There's currently only one plant. It's a 20 megawatt plant in Cavendish, Vermont, that is dispatchable. That's in the market. Everything else is behind the meter in terms of solar PV in the state.
Okay.
This is why we're seeing that the net load that is being served by the state is dropping over time.
Check this one out, Senator McDonald.
It's a little busy, so I'll walk you through that. This is showing two of the effects of solar PV. One is, Carrick has mentioned this before, solar PV has moved the timing of the summer peak to nighttime.
Yeah.
So on the low, on the upper right shows that it's on the left axis. It's from 10 p.m. to 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Hour 22 is 10 p.m. So hour 14 is 2 p.m. This is historically low. The summer peak has been around 2 p.m. But starting in 2014, you can see how the load, the timing of the summer peaks have dropped to later at night from 6 o'clock or 18 hour or hour 20, which is 8 p.m. So most recently, our peaks have been at 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. at night. And so at this time, this hour, there's really no contribution to solar because we're at nighttime. And then the curve on the lower left showing the amount of imports into the state. So this curve is above the zero line. Again, the left axis is megawatt, and the horizontal axis is time. You can see we're importing power all the time, 100% of the time, 87, 60 hours with some amount of power that's coming to the state, even with 400 megawatts of solar PV. You can see in the springtime is where we import the less, let's see, about 100 megawatts in April. That's the lowest import that we have in the state. Next slide, please, Carrick. And this is where, if you were to ask how much of our in-state energy needs is being served by in-state generation, these pie charts show at the winter peak day or the summer peak day, there's less than 25% of our needs is being served by in-state generation. You can see the storage at 6 megawatts, the methane plants, wind, hydro. Solar is very low, it's nearly 0 megawatts in the winter and in the summer. So less than 25% of our load is being served by in-state generation. Even with, as I noted earlier, it's about 1,000 megawatt of installed capacity. We're not using all of that during peak time due to the, they're all weather dependent, intermittent resources, and so they're not contributing to winter peak. Next slide, please. This is an issue you're familiar with. I just wanted to note that solar PV is contributing to the CI issue. It's very small. I think it's on the order of 15 or 12 megawatts of solar PV. It's not the cause. As we add more and more solar PV in this area, the units that are dispatchable will be subject to curtailments. Next slide.
What does binding mean when you say in that last voltage constraint is binding?
Sure. Right. So there are various constraints on the system. There's thermal, which is associated with the ability to carry flow. So it's the current flow that flows on the line. Voltage is another issue that we look at. It's the amount of, say, pressure. If you count it to hydraulics, it's pressure on the line. So if voltage is low, then it's a concern. And what we're saying here is the voltage limit is lower than the thermal limit. So that's what ISO looks at when ISO limits generation in the state, not the thermal issue. It's the lowest limit that is applied to this area.
Thermal, do you mean weather temperature or how hot your wires get?
How hot the wires get is thermal.
Okay.
And how much pressure through the line is the voltage.
Yep. High blood pressure.
Okay. So we talked about GI. We're very familiar with it, but we are monitoring the system. And what I'm showing on this slide is the substations where we see reverse power flow. So there are 10 substations or transformers in the state where power is coming from the distribution system to the transmission system. This is not necessarily a concern, but we are monitoring these locations to anticipate or predict when we'll see an issue on the system. The lowest one here is the blue line is at Vergennes. And this map is showing that at Vergennes, we get about 10 megawatts of reverse power from the distribution to transmission. And if you get the next slide, Carrick, this is where I'll explain why this is important. Reverse power is not a concern necessarily, but if you have a cluster of substations where you have this kind of phenomenon, then the aggregate impact, the cumulative impact could be negative for the system. And so you'll see that these 5 or 6 substations are all experiencing reverse power. And we're monitoring that to try to predict when we'll see an issue in this area. So the Addison County area has a lot of activity, a lot of solar PV being installed. And this could be an area where we'd exceed the transmission capacity due to reverse power with solar PV.
Hans, if that happens, if I may ask you a question, let's say reverse and it starts causing reliability issues so much, is that an eligible expense at the regional level for a transmission system improvement or no?
No, this is still related to generation capacity. So the developers or the last developer would be required to resolve this issue. It will not be an ISO funded project.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's go into the long-range plan now. We'll go over to the study approach. This is a similar approach that we used previously. We study a 20-year horizon, but we focused our attention more in the first 10 years. It's more critical. But in this plan, we look at various scenarios due to uncertainty in the forecast. We looked at the high load scenario, which represents our ability to meet our renewable energy goals. We also look at the high distributed generation scenario. And in this analysis, we refined our analysis. We did some additional investigations. We looked at generation, storage. We looked at the potential impacts of retiring the in-state diesels. We also looked at individual DU renewable goals. For example, BED had a net zero energy goal. So we wanted to take a look at that to see whether the system can address the additional loads as a result of that. One note here is that we usually use ISO New England studies when we develop the plan. This year we did not do that, and that's because the latest ISO study did not include any electric vehicle heat pump loads. ISO just started to take these loads into account. The last forecast included some EV loads and heat pump loads in Vermont. Previous to that, ISO did not have any of those loads in their forecast. So we could not use the latest study. And there's also an issue around the timing of the peak. ISO peaks at 5 o'clock still, and Vermont peaks at 8 o'clock. So the difference in peak timing affects the amount of solar PV that could be modeled in our studies. So we did not include ISO results as part of this 2021 plan. Next slide, please. And some additional assumptions in our studies. You may be aware there are a number of high voltage DC projects that were proposed in Vermont. There was a 1,000 megawatt DC project at Coolidge. This project did not go forward. It actually was postponed twice. There was a 400 megawatt DC project proposed for New Haven, and that's been canceled. So we did not model any of those large projects in our studies. And in terms of generation, we take into account the seasonality of generation. For instance, in the summer, where there's not much water, only about 10% of the hydro will be running, but 5% of wind and solar, of course, at the peak hour will be at 0%. And the numbers in the winters are higher, and we model McNeil out of service. It's the largest unit. We want it to be a bit more conservative in our analysis. But we took into account most of the other thermal units, the diesel, the gas turbines. Most of them are online to provide support to the system. All right, and in terms of our ties, no imports from New York. That's how ISO does the studies, because New York ISO does not guarantee that they'll be able to provide support to Vermont at the peak hour. And in terms of storage, the way our approach here is to use storage as a solution. We did not model storage as a load reducer to reduce our load prior to doing the analysis. We wanted to identify system concerns and then use storage as a potential solution to those concerns. Next slide. All right, so let's jump into forecast. What I want to say here is that when we talk about load in Vermont.
Hans, I'm sorry, just want to do a quick time check. We got 9 minutes, so let's make sure we, especially the capacity map that you and I discussed, but I think this is a good slide, but if you know what I'm saying here.
Okay.
9 minutes.
So load for us is really the net load. So as we zoom in on a particular distribution substation, there's gross load, or LD, which is positive, meaning we're serving that load. But that load can be reduced by energy efficiency, demand response, behind the meter generation, solar PV, and just recently, electric vehicles, heat pumps are adding to the load. And then we also had to consider storage, which could be positive, meaning it's charging or adding to the load, or discharging would be considered as a generator. So we took into account all of those when we do our studies. Next slide, please. And this is just comparing our summer peak forecast and the winter peak forecast, looking at expected forecasts. And the bottom there, the dotted lines are really the component forecast to solar PV, which is at 0 at the peak hour. Heat pumps in red, it's growing over time, and the EV load, it's also growing quite a bit. The difference between the summer and winter peak is that the winter contribution, heat pumps and electric vehicles are much higher. And so the net load, or the total load in the winter, is much higher than the winter. In the 20-year forecast, we're seeing the load will grow from about 1,000 megawatt to about 1,500 megawatts in the winter in 2040. Next slide, Carrick. And just looking at the various scenarios, this is comparing the high forecast scenario with the medium forecast. The loads are growing very fast in the high scenario. We're predicting 1,800 megawatts in 2040, which is very high compared to loads that we've seen in the past. Our all-time peak was about 1,100 megawatts. And so the system is not built to support 1,800. So this is a concern for us. 1,400 is what we saw in 10 years out in 2030. This is really our focus, and that's what we studied in the plan. Next slide, Carrick. I'll skip this one here. This is just the details behind the curves. We can go to the next one. It's showing the solar PV scenarios we studied. Our forecaster, Itron, provided an economic forecast in orange. This is based on a payback model. And this is all good, but what we wanted to see is what would be installed to meet our tier 2 obligations. We're showing the 10% tier 2 obligations for today and a 20% tier 2 obligation, because we are discussing doubling that requirement. For the 10%, we predict that we will reach 680 megawatts of solar PV in 2032. In a 20-year scenario, we're close to 1,200 megawatts in 2032. And that's what we studied in the high generation scenario. Next slide, Carrick. All right, so let's jump into results. As Carrick noted, in terms of our ability to serve load, there's really no issue. In the next 10 years, we were able to adjust flows on our ties and use operational measures to address those. We did identify some issues in the predominantly bulk system or subtransmission. The utilities will need to evaluate the subtransmission issues to see whether there are concerns that need to be addressed. Under high load scenario, there are minimal effects within the 10 years. After that, we will require even more load management, energy efficiency or storage to postpone or eliminate upgrades in the future. Next slide, Carrick. All right, so jump into the distributed generation section. Same thing as before, location matters. And so if we install solar PV in areas that do not have capacity, we will see issues, and we identified that. We can avoid these issues if we optimize distribution connected DG.
What's DG?
It's distributed generation, solar PV.
Okay, thanks. Yep.
We did some additional analysis. We looked at PV tie flows. We looked at queued projects effect, distribution transformer effects in our analysis, and we'll go over that a little later. So let's look at the next slide, which shows the map of where the transmission system will be affected solar PV to the state without regard to the system constraints. And on the left side of the state is where our transmission lines will be affected, starting from so essentially the Canadian border down to the Burlington area, all the way to Rutland. And as we import more power from New York, which happens from time to time, we'll have additional transmission facilities that will be overloaded, and those are shown on the dotted line from Rutland to Cavendish. What we are also indicating in this map is that the adding generation in Vermont will have effects in New Hampshire, from Cass County, northern New Hampshire, down to Keene. And so again, Vermont is not an island, so what we do in Vermont affects our neighbors. Next slide, Carrick. And this is we've seen this map before. It is the transmission optimization map or zonal limits. We divided the state into 16 different zones. And this is indicating where solar can be added. And this is showing that in the southern portion of the state is where we have the most capacity. And so in the southern zone, or so we can add 200 megawatts of solar. And the northern areas is where you have very little capacity, where you really at 0 and 25 megawatts near the Canadian border. We're also overlaying on this map the distribution maps that BD and GMP has developed. So if a developer wanted to know where there's an issue in the military zone, it could look at the transmission map, but also look at the GMP zone, which shows in yellow that you have some capacity, and in red, the feeders have really no capacity for additional solar PV. This is a way to provide complete information to the developer of solar PV. Next slide, Carrick. So as Carrick noted, system reliability will be maintained. And the way that happens is when the distribution feeder reaches limit, the utilities reject additional projects or requests. So no more solar PV is added to these feeders. ISO New England conducts cluster studies that identify where a number of substations together in aggregate could affect the system. And when we reach a transmission limit, we manage it just like CI, and that is we reduce or curtail generation so that transmission lines are not, their capacity is not exceeded. And when generation curtailment is not sufficient, this is where we use tight flows. We can disconnect that's running. And as a last resort, we can reinforce the grid. As part of the plan, we included a grid reinforcement only option. So total cost for that is $500 million. We certainly will not do that if we have storage or load management or other means. Next slide. This is an estimate of what a storage solution would require. Looking at a difference between the optimized distribution versus non-optimized distribution, we'll see a total of about 350 megawatts of storage required or load management. And if we need that for 4 hours, the amount of energy required would be about 1,400 megawatts. Next slide, Carrick. And this is simply saying that storage solutions that are sort of 1 hour or 2 hour solutions are really not very useful in this context. I think the minimum that we would need is 4 hours. And an example here, looking at the summer peak day, if we were to look at a typical summer peak day, we reduce the peak by 5%, need a 4-hour solution. If you reduce the peak by 10%,
What is a 2-hour and a 4-hour solution? How much capacity you can serve the grid for 4 hours, or?
right. So if you have an issue that you want to address, let's say we reduce the peak load served for the day, and you reduce that peak for 5%, right? If you look at this curve here, or the blue line, the vertical lines dropped to see hour 17 and hour 21. This is saying that to reduce the load by 5%, you need that solution to be a 4-hour for the entire period, right? For 4 hours. And if you instead drop the load by 10%, you look at the red lines from say 4 o'clock to hour 2022, that's like a 6-hour solution. You need that solution to be there for 6 hours, not 4 hours. So it depends on the load shape and how long you need the solution to be to perform. So it depends on the load shape. Is what we're saying in this map here. And the
part of the reason
curve, the longer the solution.
Sorry, Hans. I was just going to say, these slides, this kind of work was developed for people when we're having conversations. What about storage? And the criticality is, well, if it needs to last that long, that tells you how big the battery has to be. The longer it has to go, the bigger it has to be, thus the higher the cost. So that is trying, okay, well, if it's to have value, it's going to has to be this big with that price tag. That this helps people starting to scope out what size and what's the cost we're talking about to have any benefit that I'm trying to get to be able to get funding as a reliability asset. If you're telling me this is how big it is, the bigger it is, the more costly it is, basically. Is that fair, Hans?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Kerry.
Mindful of time, Mr. Chairman, I'll just say this is the last one. I hope if you took away, we're assuming some level of control, but no major transmission in 10 years. This is a great time. This is a wonderful time to be in the energy industry. We need to move faster. We need to collaborate more, but good things are happening. We're going to continue the outreach for this plan as we have there. But Mr. Chairman, with your committee, happy to continue the conversation, share any information. Just please let us know.
Okay. I have a quick question on the battery and trimming the peak off using 4 or 6 hours of storage. I'm guessing that part of the math is that those megawatt hours are the most expensive that you will ever be buying. So it helps make the storage more affordable. But how much of the time is that storage an affordable solution? If it's only shaving peaks here and there, does that mean that it's not a very functional asset for non-peak days? Because it may be.
That's the good question. The utilities are currently utilizing storage as peak load management tools, and so they're deploying the storage probably 3 or 4 times a month to be able to reduce the peak for the month. That reduces the RNS, or the regional network service cost of the utilities, and also reduce the peak for the year, which reduces their capacity cost. And the utilities have found that is a cost-effective means of addressing peak loads, is to utilize behind the meter storage to do that. It's true that if you use these storage devices for peak load management, you'd only deploy them 3 or 4 times a month. This is a very active solution. You don't do that every day.
Okay. The only thing I would add to, because Hans nailed it, the only thing I would add, Mr. Chairman, is that's one use case for storage. If you're solving for reducing peak, that has its cost benefit analysis. But there are other use cases that our distribution utility customers continue to find where batteries can be a real cost-effective and great solution working with their customers. That's what they tell us, and that's what we're seeing in effect which is why we had one of the takeaways that Hans and I mentioned earlier in the presentation.
Okay.
Right.
Well, great.
Yeah, the use cases are important. I think what helps is that if you're using storage to reduce the peak, you maintain the storage device full, right? So that you can discharge the storage device. If you use it to address excess generation, the battery is empty because you want to charge when you have the issue. So it really depends on what you're trying to resolve. You operate the battery differently.
Sure. Okay, great. Any committee questions for Mr. President and Mr. Johnson?
Just
Senator McDonald?
when you're dealing with way back from an hour ago, when you're dealing with the problem of dogs and cats and inverters, are batteries, I mean, that's a separate use of batteries to reduce that noise that takes place when you're,
Well,
that's not a peak issue, that's a melding issue of,
right.
is
Right, so
batteries used for that?
The batteries are connected to the system in the same way as solar PV. They use inverters. And so the issue of cats and dogs, this is related to the inverter itself, not the battery.
Yeah. Okay.
So you have to design the inverter in the same way, whether it's connected to a battery or solar PV or wind or any of those devices.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's a technological problem, whereas storage is like a big, it's a big physics problem or a loading problem.
Yeah. Yes, you can.
I mean, they're two different intellectual solutions, I guess.
Correct.
The only thing I would add, Senator McDonald, is that there's also a regulatory challenge. Remember you talked about at the beginning, an hour ago.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but just as we talked about an hour ago, you had noted that there was a little bit of recalcitrance at the regional level to really give due consideration to efficiency. Well, with regards to storage, our regional grid operators, the rules haven't been set yet. How do we really treat this? How are we supposed to deal with it? Sometimes it can be a generator, sometimes it is not. So sometimes it is just a taker of energy. How do we treat this? How do you get rewarded? Can it be a reliability asset? So that's those, in addition to the physics, there's the rules around money and operations that we have to work out as well.
Yeah. Written by entities that have advantages on this side, that side, or the other side. Okay.
Well,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep.
Senator Westman?
Yeah, I didn't raise my hand yet, but I was going to.
I could see that.
So, how are you, Carrot?
Very well, Senator. Very well.
How do I, after I watch this 2 or 3 more times, this presentation on YouTube, how do I come back and get a version where I can ask questions?
Well, I'm sorry if we didn't leave enough oxygen for questions. We tried to pause.
Well, I understand that, but it's a lot of material. And,
yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
It is integral if you're going to figure out how to incorporate storage into the system and what would work where, to basically understand this. So how do I, I'm going to go back and watch the YouTube with this, but I will have lots of questions. How do I, how do I make that happen?
There's at least 3 ways. One is, mindful we're being recorded. I don't know, I'll give my cell phone number out, but I'll give it to Judith. So you'll have the direct line. 2, if you would like, we could come back if your chairman agrees and not say a darn thing and only respond to questions. Happy to do that. And thirdly, I would say, Senator, happy to have a conversation where we have Hans and his team, and we'll walk you through, and just what we would do is just walk it through at your pace with whomever else you want in the room, and happy to do that.
Any of that works. I think the contact information for you would be most important.
Okay.
And anyways, good to see you.
Good to see you.
And for the committee, in case you haven't looked at today's folder on our website, so the presentation's on, so you can pull down the slideshow.
I've been watching it on the screen because I can put it larger so I can see those squiggly lines.
Yeah.
When we go down to ISO and we get to where we want to ask questions, they open that damn curtain, and then everybody, and we've gone down there a couple of times and said, please don't open the curtain and look at the layout with all the lights and the this, that, and the next thing. And it's just like they're trying to stop us from asking questions.
I guess I want to at least, I have a different view, at least a bit. I think they have made really big strides. And in fact, they asked, their COO asked to come up to meet with Velco to learn more about our telecommunications, our fiber network, see some of the analytics, in part that enables Hans to do his work. So I know they're kind of, but they are, in my view, in my judgment, they're really open and they are moving in exactly the direction you would hope, in my judgment.
Okay. Well, thank you for a good solid dose of good information, and no, it's always good to stretch a little. So maybe I think what we'll do is I'll talk to committee members and we'll look at how our schedule is working about coming back for some Q&A time too, so we can maybe dig into a couple things that are more relevant to bills and policy discussions going on now. But it's great to have the big picture. Really appreciate it.
Grateful for the opportunity and happy to, and would be equally grateful coming back anytime you'd like, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Well, thank you for all the care you put into putting that together. Great. With that committee, we're going to have we're changing gears entirely to introduce a bill. So Senator Westman has a bill, S-126. Mr. O'Grady's here to give us a walkthrough. And Senator Westman, I don't know if you want to go first or second.
No, I let him go through the bill, and the way I look at the clock, we'll be out of time. So
what's in a sentence? What is the problem that's trying to solve, Senator Westman?
Let Michael go through the bill.
Okay.
It will be
Yep. Okay,
totally
fair enough. Okay.
So I think most of you know that the state has multiple extended producer responsibility programs where the cost of collecting and ultimate disposition of a waste product is placed on the manufacturer or distributor of that product. Some of the programs include mercury containing light bulbs, the bottle bill, batteries, paint. There are several different models for those extended producer responsibility programs. They don't all exactly mirror each other. Most of the programs have a requirement that the manufacturer submit a plan to the state for the collection and disposition of those waste items. However, the e-waste program is slightly different. Instead of the manufacturer submitting a plan and getting approved, either as an individual manufacturer or part of a stewardship organization, under the e-waste program, the state issues a standard plan, contracts out with a consultant/contractor to implement the plan, and then assesses the cost of that contract to the various manufacturers and distributors, generally basically on market share. It's a little bit more technical than just market share. But what is being proposed here in S-126 is to move away from the state issuing a standard plan and contracting out, and going to a similar model, similar to mercury bulbs or paint, where the manufacturer or an organization representing many manufacturers submits a plan, implements the plan, pays for the plan, and the state no longer issues a plan and no longer cost out any contracting for that plan. So that is basically what is being proposed in S126, to move the model from the state issued standard plan to the manufacturer / organizational plan implemented by the manufacturers and distributors.
Is what's the best example of that? Batteries, or in current law and practice?
I would say the mercury bulb and the battery program. The battery program effectively built on the mercury bulb program, in that the manufacturer, the individual manufacturer is required to submit a plan, but they're allowed to participate in what is called a stewardship organization that can submit a plan and fulfill the requirements for multiple manufacturers. And that's a great model for mercury lamps and batteries, because the universe of manufacturers is relatively small. I think what led the General Assembly in its initial enactment of the e-waste program was some anxiety at the agency about the number of manufacturers of covered electronic devices, and theoretically how many plans that they might have to review and approve. But this bill, S126, tries to address that anxiety or that concern by putting a percentage limitation on the number of manufacturers that must participate in what the manufacturers here are calling the manufacturers clearinghouse. It's the same concept as a product stewardship organization. It's just an entity that serves to fulfill the requirements of the law for multiple manufacturers. And so the manufacturers clearinghouse would have to represent, and let me just to check, I believe it was 50% of the total obligations of manufacturers under this chapter. So theoretically, you should only have 2 plans if the manufacturers clearinghouse has to represent at least 50%. So that addresses that kind of concern from A&R that there'd be multiple, maybe tens or maybe more plans that they would have to review and regulate throughout the year. And so that's basically what the bill does.
It's manufacturers. Sorry to interrupt, just to make sure I understand this manufacturers clearinghouse. Is this an existing sort of like a trade organization, or this would have to be formed?
Well, it would have to be formed or authorized under state law. It is not currently authorized under the e-waste program. You would have to authorize it, and that's what S126 does in part. It authorizes that clearinghouse to take on the responsibilities of the manufacturer. I do think there's a little opportunity to clarify how the manufacturers clearinghouse works within Vermont's statutory structure. I didn't want to fool with that too much because the manufacturers were behind this. I did fool with it a little bit, but I think, in your discussion about the bill, you could clarify about what is 50% too much, is 50% too little. Do you want an individual large manufacturer to be able to submit their own plan? So there's a couple of things that you could discuss about how to make this work, to however you wanted to make it work.
So I'm thinking about this as you talk about it, a little bit like commingling versus sorted bottles in a way. So is it right to think of the manufacturers clearinghouse as those are commingled? Different manufacturers are all going to be under that plan. So they, right? But then
the one thing I would say is I think 10 years ago, the manufacturers weren't ready to come together to do this. And I think Now they are, and I think there's a few states out there in the region that have followed this model.
Okay.
And
then for the 50% that aren't commingled, so how you were saying that it would be less of a demand on A&R, but how do we know that the other 50% isn't 2,800 firms or something like that making electronic devices?
That's what the manufacturers are basically doing here. They're saying that in order to fulfill these requirements, you have to be part of the manufacturer's clearinghouse. And so, or you have to issue, there is a provision in here that allows you to issue an independent plan, but that independent plan has to be approved by A&R and has to meet all the requirements of the what is being referred to as the standard plan. But if you're going to drive the route of the manufacturer's clearinghouse, you should really only have two manufacturers clearinghouses because they have to represent 50% of the market, or 50% of the obligations. It's really kind of similar to the paint program, where I think it was something like 98% of all paint manufacturers got together in an organization to meet the obligations in this state and in other states. But that 2% still has a requirement on them, whether or not it's because they are exempt that they're not participating, or because they're trying to circumvent the regulations, or what. I won't go into what that 2% is doing, but the organization fulfills almost all of the obligations. And I think the concept here, as Senator Westman referred to, is that the manufacturers are seeing opportunity to reduce their costs by consolidating and working together in order to implement these programs across the country. I only know of one other state that does the same model as Vermont currently does now, and that's Washington State with the standard plan. Vermont based their program off of Washington's program. It's a little bit different, but it's like 90% similar. And so it's be moving away from that Washington model to more of a kind of, I would even call it maybe the Oklahoma model when I first drafted this years ago. But it's evolved in other states since then, as Senator Westman indicated.
Okay. So is the part of the goal that it could be less costly for manufacturers to come in to comply through this program? Does it deliver better performance as well in any way, like, a higher rate of recycling or better recycling or any of that stuff?
It does too. In regards to that question, it increases the collection point requirements, the convenience requirements, and says that there needs to be, for the program year starting July 1, 2022, at least 50 additional sites beyond the number that is currently required in statute. So 50 additional e-waste collection sites around the state. So that should improve convenience. And then there are performance goals that they would have to meet. And it's partly based on kind of an allocation of financial responsibility. That's where the bill gets a little technical, but it's once you drill down on it, it's really pretty understandable. So basically, they allocate their costs based on their share versus their collection. So there's kind of an incentive to run a good program.
Okay. Thank you. Any committee questions for Mr. O'Grady?
And the bill is a lot more detailed than that. I mean, I know you don't have a lot of time, but I think the manufacturers, I'm not going to take pride of authorship in this. The manufacturers did a good job of putting this together. There's some edges that need to be roughed out for Vermont law, but I think it's something that's, something that you can look at and work through and see if you want to make that policy call.
And manufacturers are generally supportive of shifting to this model. Is that,
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so Senator Westman, can you say a little bit about, did you hear from manufacturers? They said, Vermont's model's out of date.
Yes, basically that's what they said. What they basically said was 10 years ago, they weren't ready to come to the table and participate in the way that they are now. And that this would create more conformance. I think, Maine, I think they mentioned Connecticut. There's a number of states in the region that are all, so we would, and in the end, it would allow them to more collectively handle the issues of e-waste in a more efficient way, and frankly be better for the region. And and I think you should have the manufacturers in to talk about that.
Okay.
And I think it also would, the intent here is to standardize a lot of the procedures and help A&R be more effective in what they do more efficiently.
Okay, great. And let me ask just a quick question. Is it your sense that the support is broad enough for this, that it's something that you might like, that you're hoping that we might be able to at least pass through the Senate in the next month that we have left or so?
I think what they did is, with a date out in 22, I think what they most wanted to do is get this. I think they're hoping that maybe it would move next year, and that what they could do is, maybe if we had some free time, start to move it along so we were ready to better understand what the issues are. Should it be more than 50% or shouldn't it? But they wanted to make sure that they got it on our radar this year.
Okay, great. Could you work with Mr. O'Grady and Jude to start a witness list for this bill?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. O'Grady, it looked like you had something to chip in.
I just want to say you should talk to the agency, because as Senator Westman referred, there is an effort to get the agency to kind of, I don't know if it's come to a standard procedure, but this will require them to do some things that they may not be comfortable doing. And so you should talk to them about that. I understand why it's in here, why it's proposed, but I don't know how A&R will react to that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, while you were drafting, did Kathy Jameson or anyone review or get a copy or anything like that? Have you had any?
No, they did not.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's no intention not to have them in. And
sure. All right, great. All right, so yeah, Senator Westman, if you can work with Mr. Dean Jude, we'll start a witness list, and we'll include A&R and schedule time next week to come back to it, maybe possibly even Friday, the end of this week. Okay. Great. Well, it is 12 o'clock on the nose. So thank you, everyone. And there's a caucus at 12:15. And Senator Westman, you're cordially invited.
It's an issue that I'd like to hear about.
Pensions.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go.
Bring your sandwich.
If Senator Bray will send me the link to not Senator Bray, but as Senator Campion would send me the link to it, I might even go. I know that he would have some concerns about me being there, so.
Yeah, well, I better send it to you because he's already left our meeting.
Oh, he has, okay.
Yes.